Thank you so much for coming on the platform. This is truly an honor. I really appreciate everything that you have done over the years. You put in several decades of work to help sharing that African history. So we're gonna get right into it. For the viewers who may not recognize you, could you let them know who you are and definitely where you're from?
Yes, it's really an honor for me to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm a professor of the history of African art and architecture, and I teach at Harvard University. And I just think that the world on a whole doesn't know the history of Africa, even in Africa, and the incredible significance and stunning beauty of its many arts. And so that's my passion and that's my profession.
Wow, that's amazing. Now I can ask you this: when did you develop an interest in art?
In art per se, I think that goes back early. I was always interested in making art in some form or another from when I was young, and then I became really interested in looking at art and understanding its history, and began to realize that you can really look at and through art to understand the history of a period and the larger questions of not only artists, but also subjects of various works of art and how people are seeing them in that time period. So it was an amazing lens to understand the world. And so at a certain point, I decided to move in that direction as opposed to creating artworks myself.
Okay, okay. Now I can ask you, when did you actually develop a passion for African art in particular? Was it around the same time, or did that kind of come later?
Yeah, that came later. I was working the summer after my freshman year in Washington, D.C. I was working at the U.S. Senate, and that was a really hot year in D.C. with a lot of riots and tear gas. It was a tough summer. And I was living right in downtown, and that was the summer that Bobby Kennedy was killed. And I saw the hearse go by where I was living, and that was, the third of three really powerful, horrendous deaths. And so when I went back home, I'm from Vermont, and I went back home to take up my sophomore year at the University of Vermont, and then decided I really needed to do something more important with my life, more salient, more in keeping with the times. And so I quit school after my sophomore year and went to Africa in the Peace Corps. And that experience transformed me. At the time, I wasn't looking at art at all. I was working on projects to dig wells and build schools and promote local forms of agriculture. But I love the culture where I was living. I was living in a Yoruba culture in what was then Dahomey and is now the Republic of Benin.
Wow, that sounds amazing. Now I can ask you this: now how did your family feel about you traveling to Africa, especially back then? This is like you say, 1960s.
Well, it was a little bit more complicated than that because I was dating someone and of a different religion. I grew up Protestant. He was Catholic, and he was interested in going to Africa, and it was in part through him, or actually he was interested in going to the Peace Corps. He hadn't, at that point it was difficult to get in, and it was kind of in conjunction with that. I said, well, maybe I'll just go with you. And but we couldn't do that at the time and be assigned to the same place unless we got married. So, I turned to him. We were sitting in the car, and I said, I guess we got to get married. And he said, I guess so. And I said, well, I guess we're engaged. And he said, yes. And then we had to tell my parents. So from my vantage point, it was the shock that I was quitting school and getting married that probably hit them more than the idea that I was going to Africa. And I think that they were fine with that, and they came and visited while we were there. And I will say, marriage is the luck of the draw, or relationships, and we're still together. So that experience of bonding, even though I was pretty young, ended up being a positive one. He's been really critical to my whole engagement with academics and other things.
Wow, that's amazing. That's truly amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Now I can ask you, like you say, you was doing a lot of work, like digging wells and stuff while you was over there before you kind of got into the art. But what did that experience, going to Africa do for you?
It opened up a world. I just loved it. I just love everything about Africa, and I've done work in a number of places. I love the spirituality, the complexity of the spirituality. Islam, Christianity, indigenous religions, how they all play together. I love the community, the warmth of people. I just love nearly everything about it. And when I go, I just feel so much fuller, so much more in life in many respects. And so it was just an experience that transformed what I thought was possible in the world.
Okay, okay. I wanted to ask you about some of the books you wrote. I was looking online and they said you wrote 25 books. Is that correct?
I never count. I have no idea. I just love researching and writing them, then and then they come out.
Okay, okay. That's amazing. Wow. Okay, well, I wanted to ask you about some of the books in particular. You have a book, The History of African Art, Art Essentials. I believe that came out in 2023. If you could talk about what is the process for writing a piece like that?
It's a great model to pick up. The field of African art as an academic discipline has changed dramatically since I went to graduate school. At that point in time, most of our models came from anthropology, so it was pretty much ahistorical. And increasingly, many of us have pushed more into the area of looking at African art historically to actually address the issues across time and to reach out beyond the continent itself to look at Africa and the Americas, Africa and Europe, Africa and Asia. And so that book, fortunately, I knew it was going to be a very small or relatively small amount of text and images. And I really wanted to tell the story as history, as chronology. So divided into like ancient Africa, medieval, the early modern or Renaissance period, colonial period, contemporary period. It took me a couple of years to actually select the images because that I knew would be hard. I had about 100 images and I wanted them broadly around the continent and broadly defined within these periods. And I did that, and then I put them in the order that I wanted to write them in and to tell stories around each work. And it covers 150,000 years, so it is really deep. But at the same time, I wanted to make it a fun read and to make people just kind of drool over the images as much as enjoy and be moved by the text, the histories of these places. So the writing of it actually went very quickly. And I began in the contemporary chapter. I had 9 images and started there. And I worked backwards. And I learned a lot from writing that. I got a very different sense of the colonial era, which actually was one of the most creative periods in African art. And if we think about it, it's coming in the aftermath of that really horrific period of international slave trade, which marked the Renaissance in Europe, and in Africa was just a period of transformative pain, and then moved back in time. And there were a couple of things I wanted to do that were a little bit controversial. I included the Nile Valley as part of Africa. Right. And so, of course, that's got its own vast history and engaging the Nile Valley with the rest of Africa. And then I wanted to address North Africa and claiming the Roman period of the Amatsir, or the group we sometimes call Berber, within the context of African art, because they were the principal viewers and makers, and they were critical founding part of this culture. So that one was really fun to do.
Wow, wow, that's amazing. I guess I kind of wanted to touch on something you mentioned. I can remember being younger. I will never forget this. I was in the library, and I forget I asked the librarian something about the books about African history, and she was like, you know, they over here. And then I was looking and looking and looking, and then she was like, "What are you looking for? Something in particular?" And then I was like, "Yeah, I'm looking for some books about Egypt." And she was like, "Oh, that's not over here." She was like, "That's in the Middle East section." I'm like, "Egypt is in Africa, right?" And she said, "Yeah, but it's not over here." So, you know, I just
That
wanted to
that
ask. Uh-huh.
that is still in play today. It's just plain stunning. And I mean, I could tell you, I won't go into it, but a lot of the larger controversies, just around how we decide to shape the world in ways that benefit one particular history or one population or whatever. But it's definitely in the heart of Africa, and Africa, the rest of the continent, is engaging with it. I mean, I was recently at a conference on Nubia, and you can't understand Nubia without really understanding the rest of the continent and how important trade and people and ideas were in relationship between them. I think one of the other things that I knew before writing this book, and it's not a key piece in it, but I think it's important, that most people don't know about Africa, is that the Black Death, which had such a tremendously devastating role on Europe and Asia, around 1348, 1349, killing maybe a third or more of the population, also hit Africa, North Africa, the Nile Valley, but also we're finding in the middle of Africa as well. And you can see this through archaeological evidence and others. And what happened in Europe at that time, there's a real dearth of labor. And so the population, the workers, really grew up at that time and pushed back against the feudal lords. And there was a dearth of labor, in part in conjunction with this. So the slave trade, the Trans-Saharan, developed or grew in part during that period, but it was very different from what happened with the slave trade in the Americas. In Europe, it was one generation, most of the women in the houses and the men in the workshops. And in the Americas, it's basically based on race and in perpetuity. So it's a very, very different phenomenon. And not only did slavery dehumanize individuals in ways which, they can have no art, they can have no history, no culture, because they're not human, is the way it was transformed, even in this period of enlightenment in which these differences were engaged. But equally important, it took Europe 100 years to really get over the impacts of the Black Death. And by then, thanks in large measure to Africa, there were key new technologies, sciences that were in play coming from Islamic North and West Africa and elsewhere into Spain, and then from there into Europe. So by the time the Europeans are navigating the Portuguese around the coast of West Africa, 100 years later in the 1450s, they're coming in with firepower and other things, and basically transforming the continent with the taking of people who then become enslaved. And so Europe is expanding, and Africa is deeply contracting, not only in populations, but on the ability to really engage in this. And I think that a lot of the disparity and the disparagement that we see about Africa, its history, its arts, its civilization, its religions, its culture, is based on the fact of that period of industrial revolution in Europe had its sort of counter in the era of enslavement in Africa. And so when the colonial groups come in, as painful as that was, at least it is associated with the calming of the violence of taking of humans and human life in the context of the international slave trade.
Wow. Okay. I appreciate you sharing that. Okay. My next question is this: kind of growing up, and even today, when people speak about Africa, they usually kind of generalize it as being one place. But Africa is the most genetically diverse continent. It has more countries than any other continent. By you getting a chance to look at the artwork all around Africa, did you still see a large level of diversity, say, going from Mali to Benin to Nigeria, even in the West African art?
There's how would I answer this? There's an enormous amount of diversity. Absolutely. I think at the same time, there are a lot of art and cultural and historical elements that cross between different areas and regions. The rivers played a critical role in transforming ideas and bringing ideas in various places. The Niger River, the Congo River, the Nile River valleys certainly were important. And one does have that diversity, but I think it's in many respects a misstatement when one turns to Africa and looks at one linguistic map or another and sees, thousands and thousands of different languages, as if these are all very different populations. And in a sense, it really wouldn't be that much different as looking at the different dialects of French, right, before televisions, when everybody got on board and spoke the same kind of set of elements around the French language or English for that matter. And so I think that it certainly there are major differences, religion, languages, histories, politics. But I also think that we overlook the cultural ways in which many of those are brought together and continue to be to do so. And I think the other thing that often gets overlooked, when I was beginning my work on African art, the assumption was that African art was traditional. Things that were made in 1920 were identical to those that were made, say, in 1252. And one of the things that I found and that I champion in this book is that African art is some of the most creative works any place in the world. That African artists, are looking to really transform what they're looking at in very new and interesting ways. Whether you're talking about contemporary arts, and we're in a golden age of African contemporary arts, or we're talking at some of the more historic forms.
Okay. I appreciate you breaking that down. Now, can I ask you, over the years, have you, I guess, kind of developed a favorite? Is there a certain region or a certain type of African art that you love the most, or you love them all the same?
That's hard. That's really hard. It's like, which is my favorite, or whatever it is, my favorite ice cream or book or whatever. I love Nigeria. I love Benin. Mali's extraordinary. Senegal's amazing. Morocco is transformative. Egypt is just stunning. And Ethiopia, I think every human needs to go to Ethiopia. I mean, it's foundational. And so are many of these other areas as well. But I love them all. But if I had a plane ticket and could pick a couple just to drop down in for a few weeks or a few months, those would probably be close to the top.
Wow, definitely. Those are some amazing places. I love Ethiopia. I can't wait to go back.
Yeah. I mean, when I was there, what struck me was how close the Christianity that's being practiced there is to what I imagine it was in the centuries after the death of Jesus, a period when Judaism still has a really prominent role. And so I see Ethiopian Christianity as, in a way, as is sort of rooted in that legacy more than I might see that in Europe. And among the other things that struck me was I was talking with somebody about confession and learned that, well, you'd never go to confession in Ethiopia if you'd actually sinned, right? You have to live a good life. And I'm going like, wow, isn't that the point of confession? You do something wrong and then you go and, you ask for forgiveness. And so it's that kind of putting into practice your beliefs in a way that there I saw and just, going to Axum and getting up before dawn and seeing the procession of the book, right? And we were following along behind the two priests who were carrying the book. I just said, wow, this is really quite stunning. And so I got a sense really of a living art, of a living religion in ways that certainly are different from what it would have been practiced at the time. Christianity is emerging in Axum and elsewhere, but really important still today.
Yes, definitely. Let me see, we got about 10 minutes left. I wanted to ask you about another project, African Vodun Art, Psychology, and Power. If you could speak about that project and what is the difference between, people say Vodun or voodoo, is that similar?
It's the same larger religious context, that was a project. I did my first research up in the north, looking at architecture. And in the Peace Corps, I'd lived in a Yoruba town called Chabe, and it had been devastated by the military of Dahomey during the wars of enslavement, just destroyed, and in part by the women, the female troops, the Agojie. And my next project, I was looking for one and decided to go to Dahomey to see if I could understand more about it. And that was not necessarily the book that I had wanted to write. I was more interested in doing a history. But when you get into these, I'm sure it's like writing music. You kind of listen to what wants to be said at that moment. And it ended up being a book about these objects of empowerment and protection. And one of the things I learned in doing that book, of looking at these works that were pretty much disparaged as dangerous, and indeed to make sculptures in the Americas linked to Vodun or anything else was absolutely forbidden. But I began to realize that voodoo is a religion of spirituality and philosophy, of being calm, of waiting before one acts, and being thoughtful and thinking about the broader circumstances, one's family, one's social setting, the religious, various deities and the ancestors there for one, when you're evaluating the larger context. So it ended up, I think, being successful and transformative, in part because I was countering a narrative around that. And I think Western scholars are still today stunned by the success of Toussaint Louverture, who came from this part of the world in the revolution in Haiti, against the forces of Napoleon. How was that possible? So they say, oh, it must have been voodoo or whatever. And in fact, it had to do, I think, with just the brilliance of the main political actors there and the philosophy behind how they were engaging in that very difficult world.
Oh, okay. Now I can ask you this. I guess kind of growing up in school, we kind of learned, or we assumed, that a lot of the African culture, religion, music, and all those other things were lost, after the slave trade. Now, can you speak about the connection from, West Africa and some of the, I guess, slaves still bringing that culture and art? Is some of that still existing today in places like New Orleans or Haiti or?
Absolutely. And the book or the research that I'm doing now goes from Igbo Ukwu, which is the medieval Igbo site in Nigeria with really wonderful arts. And I'm addressing that through some of the contemporary artists, literary artists and visual artists. And then I take it to Igbo Landing, which was the site of that mass suicide in Savannah, Georgia in 1803. And so the part that I've been working on is looking at the context of Savannah and the living legacy of the Igbo and others there. And whether it is Harriet Powers and the Bible quilt, which actually also has complements in the Igbo area, or many other things, whether it's language or music, blacksmithing, basket making, all kinds of things, that legacy endures to this day. And what I found in doing this work is in pinpointing it to, here I'm looking at principally 1 year or a year and that period around it on the plantation life and it for the free blacks and those who are enslaved in Savannah and in Charleston in this period, I can really highlight what is happening and what kinds of things are being carried over and engaged with. And I think, I mean, we can't help but note the continuing importance of Africa to this day. I mean, there's no place in the world that's not playing some kind of jazz-related music. And jazz, like many other things, whether it's quilts or otherwise, comes from many sources. But the richness of the African connections are always there. And when one looks at the African-American quilts, among others, and their rich complexity and diversity of forms, the movement away from symmetry towards abstraction and towards bold colors as opposed to soft pastels, you begin to see what in a true sense, this color that Africa is providing is really making to these traditions and to the American continent more generally.
Yeah, that's very, very important because, like you say, jazz, when I think of jazz, I think of New Orleans, I think of blues, and, you know, a lot of our music come from that area. And then, like you say, even the quilts and the dances and, you know, and so forth, because I kind of read about Congo Square and places like that where they were able to maintain a little bit more than maybe some of the other ports where the slaves was brought in. So that's definitely important. Now let me see. Okay, we about 3 minutes left. So I guess I just wanted to ask you. You said you going to Brazil. Is that work related or is that just kind of vacation?
No, it's well, it's how do you say? It's between the two. I'm going with some colleagues from here, and we're going with graduate students and faculty and others. And I don't consider it work. I consider it just a wonderful chance to experience this world. I'd gone with some members of this group to Cuba earlier, and these kinds of trips really open your eyes to different parts of the world. I haven't even looked at the itinerary yet, but I will in a couple of days, and I simply can't wait.
Wow, that sounds exciting, right? It's a dream for most people. So, like you say, it's not really work. I got a chance. I studied abroad in Brazil. It's a very beautiful country, full of culture, full of music. So it's definitely. But you have you been there before, or is this your first time?
This is my first trip.
Oh wow, okay. Well, safe travels. I'm sure you're gonna love the food, the music, and everything.
I
So.
can't wait, and thank you.
Yeah, definitely. So I want to thank you again so much for everything that you contributed and the things that you're currently working on. I definitely look forward to those things as well. So I'm gonna have to go back and check out some more of your books and stuff like that. But I really, really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you very much, Taye, and thank you so much for all you do. It's inspirational, and
Thank you.
Great. Okay, talk soon.
All right, take care.
Yep. Bye bye.